Reversi is a strategy board game for 2 players, played on an 8x8 uncheckered board. There are 64 identical game pieces called discs, which are light on one side and dark on the other. Players take turns placing discs on the board with their assigned color facing up. During a play, any discs of the opponent's color that are in a straight line and bounded by the disc just placed and another disc of the current player's color are turned over to the current player's color. The object of the game is to have the majority of discs turned to display your color when the last playable empty square is filled. Reversi was most recently marketed by Mattel under the trademark Othello. History. Original version. The game Reversi was invented in 1883 by either of 2 Englishmen, Lewis Waterman or John W. Mollett, and gained considerable popularity in England at the end of the 19th century. The game's first reliable mention is in the August 21, 1886 edition of the Saturday Review. Later mention includes an 1895 article in the New York Times. Reversi is something like Go Bang, and is played with 64 pieces. In 1893, the well-known German games publisher Ravensburger started producing the game as one of its first titles. 2 18th-century continental European books dealing with a game that may or may not be Reversi are mentioned on page 14 of the spring 1989 Othello Quarterly, and there has been speculation, so far without documentation, that the game has even more ancient origins. Modern version. The modern version of the game, the most regularly used rule set, and the one used in international tournaments, is marketed and recognized as Othello, which was perfected by Goro Hasegawa, originated in Japan in the 1970s. There are 2 differences from the original game. The first 4 pieces go in the center, but in a standard diagonal pattern, rather than being placed by players. Each player has up to 64 pieces, rather than being limited to 32 pieces each. Hasegawa established the Japan Othello Association on March 1973, and held the first National Othello Championship on April 4, 1973 in Japan. The Japanese game company Tsukuda Original launched Othello in late April 1973 in Japan under Hasegawa's license, which led to an immediate commercial success. The name was selected by Hasegawa as a reference to the Shakespearean play Othello, the Moor of Venice, referring to the conflict between the Moor Othello and Iago, and more controversially, to the unfolding drama between Othello, who is black, and Desdemona, who is white. The green color of the board is inspired by the image of the general Othello, valiantly leading his battle in a green field. It can also be likened to a jealousy competition, since players engulf the pieces of the opponent, thereby turning them to their possession. Othello was first launched in the U.S. in 1975 by Gabriel Industries, and it also enjoyed commercial success there. It is said Othello game sales have exceeded $600 million and more than 40 million classic games have been sold in over 100 different countries. Hasegawa also wrote How to Othello in Japan in 1974, which was later translated into English and published in the U.S. in 1977 as How to Win at Othello. Kabushiki Kaisha Othello, which is owned by Hasegawa, registered the trademark Othello for board games in Japan, and Tsukuda Original registered the mark in the rest of the world. All intellectual property regarding Othello outside Japan is now owned by Mega House, a Japanese toy company that acquired Palbox, the successor to Tsukuda Original. Mega House has gratefully acknowledged the late James R. Becker and Anjar Co. for their role in successfully marketing, licensing, selling, promoting, distributing, and popularizing Othello-branded products in the U.S. and around the world outside Japan since 1975. Rules. Each of the disc's 2 sides corresponds to 1 player. They are referred to here as light and dark after the sides of Othello pieces. but any counters with distinctive faces are suitable. The game may, for example, be played with a chessboard and Scrabble pieces, with one player letters and the other backs. The historical version of Reversi starts with an empty board, and the first two moves by each player are in the four central squares of the board. The players place their discs alternately with their color facing up and no captures are made. If either the second player chooses to move to the square diagonal to the first player or the first player's second move is not to this square given the choice, then a starting position before flipping moves commence that differs from the standard Othello position arises. It is also possible to play variants of Reversi in Othello wherein the second player's second move may or must flip one of the opposite-colored discs. For the specific game of Othello, the rules state that the game begins with 4 discs placed in a square in the middle of the grid. 2 facing white side up, 2 pieces with the dark side up, with same colored discs on a diagonal with each other. Convention has initial board positions such that the discs with dark side up are to the northeast and southwest, though this is only marginally meaningful to play. If the discs with dark side up are to the northwest and southeast, the board may be rotated by 90 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise. The dark player moves first. Dark must place a piece with the dark side up on the board, in such a position that there exists at least one straight occupied line between the new piece and another dark piece, with one or more contiguous light pieces between them. In the below situation, dark has the following options indicated by translucent pieces. After placing the piece, dark turns over all light pieces lying on a straight line between the new piece and any anchoring dark pieces. All reverse pieces now show the dark side, and dark can use them in later moves, unless light has reversed them back in the meantime. In other words, a valid move is one where at least one piece is reversed. If dark decided to put a piece in the topmost location, one piece gets turned over, so that the board appears thus. Now light plays. This player operates under the same rules, with the roles reversed. Light lays down a light piece, causing a dark piece to flip. Possibilities at this time appear thus. Light takes the bottom left option and reverses one piece. Players take alternate turns. If one player cannot make a valid move, play passes back to the other player. When neither player can move, the game ends. This occurs when the grid has filled up or when neither player can legally place a piece in any of the remaining squares. This means the game may end before the grid is completely filled. This possibility may occur because one player has no pieces remaining on the board in that player's color. In over-the-board play, this is generally scored as if the board were full. Example where the game ends before the grid is completely filled. The player with the most pieces on the board at the end of the game wins. An exception to this is that if a clock is employed, then if one player defaults on time, that player's opponent wins regardless of the board configuration, with varying methods to determine the official score where one is required. In common practice over the internet, opponents agree upon a time control, typically from 1 to 30 minutes per game per player. Standard time control in the World Championship is 30 minutes. And this or something close to it is common in over-the-board tournament play generally. In time-defaulted games, where disc differential is used for tie breaks in tournaments or for rating purposes. One common over-the-board procedure for the winner of defaulted contests to complete both sides moves with the greater of the result thereby, or one disc difference in the winner's favor being the recorded score. Games in which both players have the same number of discs, their color at the end, are not very common, but also not rare, and these are designated as tees and scored as half of a win for each player in tournaments. The term draw for such may also be heard, but is somewhat frowned upon. What are generally referred to as transcripts sheets are generally in use in tournament over-the-board play, with both players obligated to record their game's moves by placing the number of each move in an 8x8 grid. This both enables players to look up past games of note and tournament directors and players to resolve disputes where claims that an illegal move, flip or other anomaly are voiced. An alternative recording method not requiring a grid is also in use, where positions on a board are labeled left to right by letters A through H and top to bottom by digits 1 through 8, that has A through H left to right, and also that the perspective may be that of either player, so that the very first move of a game may be D3, C4, F5 or E6. This alternate notational scheme is used primarily in verbal discussions or where a linear representation is desirable in print, but may also be permissible as during game transcription by either or both players. Tournament play using ordinary sets rather than a computer interface, where this cannot be an issue, have various ways of handling illegal moves and over or under flipping. For example, permitting either player to make a correction going back some fixed number of moves is one procedure that has been used. Significant variants of the game, such as where the starting position differs from standard or the objective is to have the fewest pieces one's color at the end, are sometimes, but rarely, played. Strategic elements. Strategic concepts in Reversi include openings, corners, mobility, edge play, parity, end gameplay and looking ahead. Openings for relatively inexperienced players. The opening part of a game of Reversi is generally not very easy to make sense of. A rule of thumb on the opening is that a good opening is one that leads to a good middle game. By and large, good moves in the very earliest stages are determined by whether there is a refutation to a move only and few other truly general considerations, aside from what exactly constitutes a refutation. The first move is no choice at all other than for the purpose of the player's possible sense of ideal visualization. The first move by light gives 3 choices, and, in fact, it is generally accepted at the highest level that one of these actually may be successfully refuted, that being what is known as the parallel opening. The other 2 choices by light are called the diagonal opening and the perpendicular opening, and these 3 in the order mentioned, with F5 as dark's first move are F4, F6 and D6. As this subtopic is generally broad and complex, at high levels of play it is routine for 10 or more moves to be rattled off from rote memorization by both players, traveling down well-worn paths. And there is a common naming system for diverse early game move choices. It is probably best to leave expansion of this topic to a separate article, specifically dedicated to the issue, or to say no more. Corners. Corner positions, once played, remain immune to flipping for the rest of the game of being termini of horizontal, vertical and diagonal lines. More generally, a piece is stable when, along all 4 axes, it is in terminal position, or if from it along the axis one reaches a terminal disk passing only through disks the same color. These are not the only kinds of stable disk, however, and occupying a corner may often be a grave error if one allows one's opponent to create a wedge that results in him or her gathering more stable disks. This can render occupying the corner largely useless, and often much worse than that because of loss of tempo. Mobility. An opponent playing with reasonable strategy will not so easily relinquish the corner or any other good moves. So to achieve these good moves, a player must force its opponent to play moves that relinquish those good moves. One of the ways to achieve this involves reducing the number of moves available to the player's opponent. Ideally, this will eventually force the opponent to make an undesirable move. Edges. Edge pieces can anchor flips that influence moves to all regions of the board. If played poorly, this can poison later moves by causing players to flip too many pieces and open up many moves for the opponent. However, playing on edges where an opponent cannot easily respond drastically reduces possible moves for that opponent. The square immediately diagonally adjacent to the corner, when played in the early or middle game, typically guarantees the loss of that corner. Nevertheless, such a corner sacrifice is sometimes played for some strategic purpose. Playing to the edge squares adjacent to the corner can also be dangerous if it gives the opponent powerful forcing moves. Parity is one of the most important parts of the strategy. In short, the concept of parity is about getting the last move in every empty region in the endgame, and thereby increasing the number of stable discs. The concept of parity led to a change in the perception of the game, as it led to distinct strategies for playing black and white. It forced black to play more aggressive moves and gave white the opportunity to stay calm and focus on keeping the parity. As a result, the opening books and mid-game were focused on black being the attacker and white being the defender. The concept of parity also controls how edge positions are played and how edges interact. Endgame. For the endgame, the strategies will typically change. Special techniques such as sweeping, gaining access, and the details of move order can have a large impact on the outcome of the game. Actual counting of discs in the very final stages is often critical, but sometimes in human play an inaccurate choice for disc differential can be better than an accurate one in terms of the expected outcome. Brightwell quotient, invented by the British mathematician, and 3 times runner-up at the World Championship and 5 times British champion Graham Brightwell. This is the tiebreaker that is now used in many tournaments including the WOC. If 2 players have the same number of points in the 13 rounds WOC Swiss, the tie is resolved in favor of the player with the higher Brightwell quotient. The Brightwell quotient tiebreaker is calculated as follows. A constant C is calculated. It is the integer nearest to divided by B. If any of the player's opponents have withdrawn in the course of the tournament, ignore such games for the moment. Also, if a player has been paired against bar, leave out such a game. C. Calculate the total number of discs scored by the player in all games not covered by step B and add C times the sum of points scored by all of the player's opponents, except those who have withdrawn. D. For each game against an opponent who has withdrawn, and each by received, add half the number of squares on the board plus to the result calculated in step C. The number resulting is the player's BQ. Computer opponents and research. Because of difficulties in human look-ahead, peculiar to Othello because of the apparent strategic meaninglessness of internal discs, and the attractiveness of the game to programmers. The best Othello computer programs have easily defeated the best humans since 1980, when the program The More beated the reigning world champion. In 1997, Legistello defeated the human champion Takeshi Murakami with a score of 6-0. Analysts have estimated the number of legal positions in Othello is at most 1028, and it has a game tree complexity of approximately 1058. Mathematically, Othello still remains unsolved. Experts have not absolutely resolved what the outcome of a game will be where both sides use perfect play. However, analysis of thousands of high-quality games appears to lead to a reliable conclusion that, on the standard 8x8 board, perfect play on both sides results in a draw. When generalizing the game to play on an n×n board, the problem of determining if the first player has a winning move in a given position is PSPACE complete. On 4x4 and 6x6 boards under perfect play, the second player wins. The first of these results is relatively trivial, and the second dates to around 1990. World Othello Championship. Bibliography. Mark Mant. Introduction to Basic Othello Strategy and Algorithms, 2001. British Othello Federation Newsletters.